The sound of Elvis Presley's voice echoed through the MGM studio, but it wasn't the same voice that had once made the world dance. It was a voice heavy with frustration, a voice that sounded like it belonged to a man who was tired of being a prisoner in his own life. The year was 1965, and Elvis was filming Girl Happy. The script was as bad as the songs, and the entire production felt like a joke, but Elvis had no choice. He had signed too many contracts, and Colonel Tom Parker, his manager, had a tight grip on his career. Elvis walked onto the set, his eyes red from lack of sleep. He had been up all night, tossing and turning, his mind filled with thoughts of escape. He had tried to break free from the Colonel's control, but every time he did, the Colonel would remind him of all the money he had made and the deals he had secured. It was a constant reminder that Elvis was trapped, a pawn in the Colonel's game. "Elvis, are you ready for this scene?" the director called out. Elvis nodded, but inside he was seething. He knew the song was a joke, a parody of his earlier, more serious work. The lyrics were absurd, and the music was catchy but hollow. He had to sing Fort Lauderdale Chamber of Commerce for the umpteenth time, and each time it felt like a nail in his coffin. "Let's do this," he muttered to himself, taking a deep breath. As the cameras rolled, Elvis tried to put on his best performance, but it was hard to hide the frustration. He sang the song with a forced smile, and the crew around him tried to stay professional, but it was clear that everyone knew this was a farce. When the scene was finally over, Elvis turned to his friends, Lamar, Fike, and Marty, and muttered, "I can't do this anymore." Lamar and Marty exchanged worried glances. They had seen Elvis go through this before, but this time it felt different. The tension was palpable, and they could see the toll it was taking on their friend. Elvis's eyes were bloodshot, and his hands shook slightly. He was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. "Come on, let's take a break," Marty suggested, putting a hand on Elvis's shoulder. Elvis nodded and followed them to a quiet corner of the set. They sat down and Elvis leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. "I'm tired of being Elvis," he said softly. "I'm tired of being the king of rock and roll. I just want to be me, you know, but the Colonel won't let me. He's got me in this damn suit, and I can't get out of it." Lamar and Marty knew exactly what he meant. The Colonel had built Elvis into a superstar, but he had also created a persona that Elvis was now trapped in. Every time Elvis tried to break free, the Colonel would remind him of all the money and the fame he had to lose. It was a never-ending cycle of control and manipulation. Elvis opened his eyes and looked at his friends. "I want to do something different. I want to make real music again, not this crap. But the Colonel won't listen. He just wants to keep making money, and I'm sick of it." Lamar and Marty nodded, understanding the weight of Elvis's words. They had been with him through the highs and the lows, and they knew that this was a turning point. Elvis was at a breaking point, and they had to figure out a way to help him before it was too late. The three of them sat in silence for a moment, trying to come up with a plan. But as they sat there, they could hear the director calling out, "Elvis, we're ready for the next scene." Elvis sighed, standing up. "I guess we'll have to figure it out later. For now, I have to go do another round of the same old thing." As he walked back to the set, Lamar and Marty watched him go, their hearts heavy. They knew that the road ahead would be tough, but they were determined to help Elvis find his way out of the prison he was in. Because deep down, they all knew that Elvis was more than just the king of rock and roll. He was a man who wanted to be free. Elvis was standing in the recording studio, surrounded by a large orchestra. It was 1965, and he was working on a soundtrack for another movie. He was frustrated. The songs felt like they were all the same, and the movies were no better. He started to rant, "Goddammit, I'm tired of all these fucking songs, and I'm tired of these damn movies. I get in a fight with somebody in one scene, and in the next one I'm kissing the dog, and these songs suck like donkeys." He was fed up with the whole thing. What difference does it make how many times we do it? The song is a piece of shit. No one could calm him down. Finally, he said, "I'll tell you what. You just cut the tracks of the songs in this next movie, and I'll come in later and put my voice on." Elvis's frustration wasn't just about the music. The world was changing, and he felt left behind. The Beatles had arrived, and their music was fresh and exciting. They were making movies too, but their films were different. A Hard Day's Night and Help had a lot of wit, and Elvis's movies, like Girl Happy and Tickle Me, seemed old-fashioned in comparison. His records weren't as big hits as they used to be, and the music wasn't as innovative. The Beatles were the new thing, and Elvis felt threatened. He never talked about it much, but deep down he was worried. When the Beatles appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show, Elvis's manager, Colonel Parker, sent a telegram welcoming them to America. It made it seem like Elvis was a fan, but it was all a show. Colonel even tried to set up a meeting, but Elvis insisted, "If they want to see me, they can come over here." He wanted to prove a point. It was all about his ego. Lamar Fike, one of Elvis's friends, went to England in 1963 and saw the Beatles perform. He was blown away. "The only time I've seen anything like this is with Elvis," he said. When he told Elvis about it, Elvis didn't care. He was focused on his own world, and he didn't want to admit that things were changing. In 1965, Elvis and his friends were in Hawaii filming Paradise Hawaiian Style. Herman's Hermits, another British group, was also there. They arranged a meeting with Elvis through Colonel. Peter No One, the lead singer, tried to joke around, but Elvis wasn't impressed. No one asked, "Tell me, Elvis, who's your favorite group?" Elvis, with a sly smile, said, "Los Angeles Police Department." Everyone laughed, but no one was left speechless. Tom Jones was another artist who posed a threat to Elvis. He was a powerful singer, and his hits like "It's Not Unusual" were popular. Elvis called him Sock Dick, thinking Jones used a rolled-up sock to look more well-endowed, but Elvis still respected his music. When Tom Jones came to visit Elvis on the set, he was nervous and respectful. Elvis liked Tom's record "It's Not Unusual," and he told him so. But when Tom's agent tried to make a business deal, Elvis got agitated. He felt used, and his friends stepped in to protect him. Elvis's relationship with the Beatles was complicated. He liked some of their songs, like "Hey Jude" and "Yesterday," but he didn't understand their cultural impact. He was skeptical of the counterculture and the political movements of the 1960s. He didn't like the idea of tune in, turn on, drop out, and he was against the anti-war movement. He was gung-ho about military matters and could quote General MacArthur's farewell speech verbatim. When he got upset, he would say, "I bid you a fond, affectionate, fucking farewell," and walk out of the room. Elvis was a man of contradictions. He supported civil rights, but didn't speak out about it. He cared about individual people, but wasn't a big humanitarian. He liked heroes like General Omar Bradley, and even met him a few times. Bradley was a legendary figure, and Elvis was fascinated by him. But when the Beatles got involved with the Maharishi and started talking about marijuana, Elvis was horrified. He thought they were a bad influence on kids, even though he was taking pills himself. Elvis wanted his music to sound raw and powerful, especially when he was making the soundtracks for his movies. He often asked for the bass to be brought forward, and his voice to be mixed down. He thought RCA was bringing his voice out too much, and it made him angry. He was always fighting for his records to sound different, to stand out in a world that was moving on without him. Elvis's music was a big part of his life, but behind the scenes things weren't always smooth. His manager, Colonel Parker, had a lot of control over what songs Elvis recorded and how his records were made. This sometimes led to conflicts and issues that affected Elvis's music and career. Elvis would often get frustrated when the people in New York who mixed his tapes would change the sound of his music. He wanted the drive and energy that he heard in the Beatles' records, but he didn't want his voice to be too prominent. He wanted the background singers to be just as noticeable. But the Colonel would always step in and tell RCA, the record company, to make Elvis's voice stand out more. This often made the final records sound different from what Elvis wanted. The Colonel was very controlling. He would approve every final mix before it was released. RCA had to send the mixes to him, and he would make changes. Sometimes, the acetates early versions of the records that Elvis and his friends listened to after the recording sessions sounded better than the final records that the Colonel adjusted. The Colonel even charged RCA for the pictures they used on the album covers, which is why RCA didn't have many photos of Elvis to use. Elvis's songs often came from a publishing company called Hill and Range, owned by Gene and Julian Aberbach. The Colonel had a deal with them, and he got a cut of the profits. This meant that Elvis ended up recording a lot of songs that weren't the best, just because the Colonel and Hill and Range wanted to make more money. Some of these songs were old-fashioned and didn't fit with the current music trends. Lamar Fike, one of Elvis's friends, worked for Hill and Range and helped choose songs for Elvis. He believed that Hill and Range served Elvis well, and he was proud of the hits they produced, like Kentucky Rain and Indescribably Blue. However, Marty Lacker, another friend, thought that Elvis could have had better songs if he hadn't been so controlled by the Colonel and Hill and Range. The Colonel and Freddie Bienstock, who managed Hill and Range, would listen to new songs and decide which ones Elvis would hear. This meant that Elvis didn't have much choice in the songs he recorded. Over time, this led to a lack of creativity and energy in Elvis's music. He started to sound like a parody of himself, copying the demo singers instead of bringing his own style to the songs. In the early years, Elvis had a lot of hits, but as time went on, his success in the charts decreased. From the mid-1960s to the late 1960s, Elvis didn't have a top 5 hit for 4 years. This was partly because of the poor quality of the songs he was given to record. The Colonel and Hill and Range also controlled who could write songs for Elvis. They would ask songwriters to give up part of their copyright in exchange for having Elvis record their songs. This was good business for the Colonel and Hill and Range, but it wasn't always fair to the songwriters. Some of them, like Ivory Joe Hunter and Dolly Parton, refused to give up their rights, and Elvis never got to record their songs. Despite the criticism, Lamar Fike believed that the Colonel's control was a way to protect Elvis's interests and make the most money. However, Marty Lacker thought that Elvis would have been more successful and happier if he had more control over his music and career. Elvis's relationship with his management and the publishing companies was complex. He could have changed things if he wanted to, but he didn't. This left him in a situation where he often had to record songs that weren't the best, and his music suffered as a result. The air around Graceland was thick with tension. Marty Lacker remembered the day vividly. It was late 1963, and Elvis was in a foul mood. The Colonel had a bright idea: buy Franklin Delano Roosevelt's presidential yacht, the Potomac, and donate it to charity. It seemed like a great publicity stunt, but things didn't go as planned. The yacht was in terrible shape, but the Colonel only had one side painted the side that would face the cameras. When Elvis and Danny Thomas, the founder of St. Jude Children's Research Hospital, signed the papers in Long Beach Harbor, Elvis was all smiles for the cameras. But as soon as they got in the car, Elvis was fuming. Danny Thomas had leaned over and whispered, "Why in the hell did you buy this piece of shit?" The charity didn't want it, and the whole thing was a disaster. By 1964, the tension in the group was getting worse. Joe Esposito and Charlie Hodge, two of Elvis's closest aides, were causing problems. Joe, in particular, was making frequent reports to the Colonel, which created a lot of friction. Red West, another member of Elvis's inner circle, hated Joe's attitude. One day, Red almost came to blows with Joe. Joe was smart and college-educated, but he often acted like he was better than the others. This didn't sit well with the guys who had been with Elvis since the beginning. Lamar Fike, another longtime friend, had no use for Joe. After Elvis died, Joe had the nerve to criticize Lamar. Lamar told him, "The only reason I put up with you was to keep some sort of harmony in this organization. You got no hold on anybody here. People are tired of your shit." Elvis knew what was going on, but he rarely fired anyone directly. Instead, he'd make their life miserable until they quit. This is exactly what happened with Joe. During a trip back from a movie in Texas, Elvis and Joe had a heated argument. Elvis accused Joe of letting the press know they were staying at a Holiday Inn, causing a crowd to gather. Elvis was furious and told Joe off. Joe tried to stay, but Elvis refused to talk to him for days. Finally, Joe left, and Marty became the new foreman. Marty's life changed overnight. He moved into the garage apartment at Graceland and got a raise, but the drama didn't stop there. Billy Smith, Elvis's cousin, had a run-in with Elvis over a hairdresser named Sal Orifice. Sal was starting his own business and had to quit, but Elvis didn't know that. When Billy told Elvis that Sal was quitting, Elvis thought Billy had fired him. In a fit of rage, Elvis fired everyone, including Billy. Billy packed his bags and left, but Elvis soon realized his mistake. He called Alan, the only one left to bring Billy back. Billy, still angry, refused at first. But after a tense phone call, Elvis apologized and rehired him. Around this time, a new hairdresser named Larry Geller joined the group. Larry was into mystic and Eastern religions, and he had a big influence on Elvis. Before Larry, Elvis only read the Bible. His mother had taught him to find answers in the Bible, but as he got more famous, he became skeptical of preachers. Larry's influence led Elvis to explore other spiritual beliefs, which sometimes confused and troubled him. The inner circle of Elvis's life was a complex web of loyalty, betrayal, and friendship. Despite the challenges, they all stayed close, even when things got tough. But as the years went on, the pressure and tension only grew, leading to more conflicts and ultimately tragedy. Elvis's world was a mix of fame, fun, and a lot of complicated relationships. One of the people who got close to him was Larry Geller. Geller was a hippie from the 60s, and he had a knack for talking about all sorts of spiritual stuff. He'd show up at Elvis's house with books on different religions, like the Tibetan Book of the Dead and the Urantia book. Geller was always trying to convince Elvis that he should be more than just a famous singer, that he should be a spiritual leader, a messenger. At first, Elvis and his friends liked Geller, but things started to feel off. Elvis played a shake, and the only good thing about the movie was that Colonel Parker didn't get his way with adding a talking camel to the story. After Marty became the foreman, the dynamics in Elvis's camp changed. Colonel Parker, who used to get information from the guys, started pushing harder. He wanted to know every move Elvis made. One day, Billy Smith was on a car ride back from Palm Springs with the Colonel. The Colonel kept talking about how Vernon, Elvis's dad, wasn't good with money. Billy finally said, "Colonel, Vernon is Elvis's dad. Whether he makes mistakes or not, it's still his dad. I won't get in the middle of that." The Colonel never brought it up again. Marty Lacker had a lot of run-ins with Colonel Parker. When Marty became foreman, the Colonel would call and ask, "What's going on? What did Elvis do today?" Marty would just say, "Same old stuff, Colonel." The Colonel would push for more details, but Marty never gave in. He knew the Colonel wasn't to be trusted. Colonel Parker wasn't crazy about Marty, neither was Vernon. Marty's job as foreman was to organize the guys, handle the studio calls, and manage the money. Elvis had an amazing memory, and hardly ever flubbed his lines. In between takes, he'd sit in his dressing room and read his script. One day, the Colonel asked Marty to write a $50,000 check to the Motion Picture Relief Fund. The Colonel said it was a charity donation, and that Frank Sinatra would be there to take photos. Marty wrote the check, but added a note saying it was given to Sinatra on the set, as per Bob Hope's request. He did this to protect himself, in case the Colonel ever accused him of stealing. Money was a big source of tension in Elvis's camp. Vernon would sometimes confront Elvis about his spending, which only made Elvis spend more. Elvis would say, "I make the money and I'll spend it how I want." One time he bought 11 Harley-Davidson motorcycles for his friends just to show Vernon. Marty had a grudging respect for Vernon. He did the best he could. Vernon's skin always looked young, and he gave Marty a tip about using only cold water on his face to avoid wrinkles. But Elvis's hygiene habits changed over the years. In the later years, he wouldn't shower for days, and the drugs were a big factor in that. When Marty became foreman, he had to handle the expense reports. One night, after staying up for days, he fell asleep at his desk, pen in hand. Elvis and Red found him there the next morning and had a good laugh. At Christmas, Marty and Elvis would buy gifts for everyone. Elvis liked Marty's taste and trusted him to choose the right things. They even gave gifts to people who had been fired or who had left the group. Marty was surprised when Elvis didn't buy furniture for Joe's daughter, even though Joe had mentioned it. Elvis said, "I'll buy her a nice cross on a chain instead." Colonel Parker would send gifts to the guys, but they were often cheap and crummy. One year he sent stuffed animals, and another year he sent foot massagers. He always made a big deal about it, even though the gifts were not very valuable. Marty felt it was petty and cheap. In late 1964, Alan got married. Right after the ceremony, someone totaled his car. Elvis walked them outside, asked for $1, and gave Alan the keys to Priscilla's new Corvair. Elvis loved to play Santa Claus and spend money, especially when he was high. From 1964 on, things got really strange. a guy named Geller started working with Elvis. Geller would teach Elvis about words and break them down into syllables. Elvis thought it was a good learning experience and started sharing it with the rest of the group. Things were changing, and the camp was getting more and more unusual. Billy Smith and Marty Lacker had a lot to say about Elvis's curious side, especially when it came to his interest in words and books. Billy remembered how Elvis would find a word in the dictionary, learn it, and remember it word for word. He had a hunger to learn and would often pick up the right book and turn to the exact page about a subject he was interested in. One day, Marty Lacker was at Graceland when Elvis asked him to buy 10 dictionaries and 10 yellow legal pads. Elvis wanted to have word sessions in the evenings. They sat around the jungle room, which back then wasn't jungle-themed. It had big round tables and high chrome legs. Elvis would open the dictionary, find a word, break it into syllables, and they'd all say it out loud. Lamar Fike recalled how Elvis got really hung up on the word condominium, repeating it over and over like a mantra. Elvis's interest in religion and spirituality was just as intense. Billy Smith mentioned that Larry Geller would bring religious books to show Elvis, and Elvis started giving them to people. Books like The Impersonal Life, The Prophet by Khalil Gibran, and The Voice of Silence by Madame Blavatsky became part of his collection. Elvis was particularly fascinated by the idea of reincarnation. He thought only strong people got to come back, and he was pretty sure his mother, Gladys, would be reborn. He even joked that he'd haunt everyone after he was gone. Marty Lacker shared a story about how Larry Geller tried to convince Elvis to become a New Age evangelist. Geller believed that with Elvis's fame, he could become a powerful religious leader. But Marty stepped in and told Geller to shut up, saying Elvis wasn't interested in being a religious messenger. Elvis agreed, and the conversation ended there. However, the religious talk continued, and it made Elvis uncomfortable. One night, Elvis and Geller even hid from the group, and Marty suspected Geller was trying to influence Elvis further. Elvis's search for fulfillment led him to experiment with different things, including drugs. In the mid-1960s, marijuana and LSD were around the house. Billy Smith said Elvis tried marijuana, but didn't like it because it burned his throat. Lamar Fike recalled a time when they made marijuana brownies and accidentally gave them to Elvis. He and Priscilla stayed in the bedroom for 4 days, high the whole time. When Lamar realized what happened, he told Elvis, and Elvis asked for more. Marty Lacker explained that Elvis didn't consider himself a drug addict. He thought drug addicts were people who used street drugs like heroin and cocaine. Elvis's drug use was different, and he didn't feel guilty about it. He had his own religion, and he believed his drugs were part of his routine. Elvis's curiosity about spirituality led him to explore self-realization, a belief system that taught that everyone is part of God. Larry Geller introduced him to Sri Daya Mata, who ran a self-realization park in Santa Monica. Elvis was fascinated by the idea that the body of the Yogi Paramahansa Yogananda didn't decay after death. He started visiting the park and giving money to Daya Mata, which upset Vernon, Elvis's father. Despite his interest in these teachings, Elvis never fully embraced the idea of being a religious leader. He always felt his purpose was to entertain people and make them feel good through his music. Marty Lacker remembered how Elvis would sometimes get on preaching sprees, jumping up on the coffee table and delivering sermons. These sermons were often funny, especially when he was on pills, and he'd talk about Jesus and Mary or Moses in a humorous way. Elvis's ego was legendary, and Lamar Fike often joked about it. One morning, Lamar asked Elvis what lake they were walking across that day, and Elvis would get mad. Despite his larger-than-life personality, Elvis's influence extended far beyond his music. Even after his death, fans started Elvis churches and paid high prices for his personal items, believing he had a divine presence. Through it all, Elvis remained a complex and enigmatic figure, always searching for something more, whether it was through words, books, or spiritual teachings. His life was a blend of fame, curiosity, and a deep desire to find meaning in the world. Elvis was always a mystery, even to those who knew him best. The drugs and his spiritual quests made him see things that others couldn't. One night, Lamar Fike and Elvis were sitting on Elvis's bed at Graceland. Elvis told Lamar that he believed there would always be a star in Lamar's crown, because Lamar was kind and not self-centered. Elvis, on the other hand, admitted he often thought about himself too much, and it bothered him. Elvis's mind was a wild place. He would claim he could part the clouds, see dead people in the sky, and even spot UFO. One time, while driving through the Arizona desert, they saw a man with a white beard walking alone. Everyone thought it was Jesus. Another time, they stopped the car to check on what they thought were blinding lights from an accident, but there was no one around. These moments scared them, but also fascinated Elvis, who was always searching for something more. Elvis's relationship with Joe Esposito was complicated. Joe left for a while, but came back when he needed the job. Elvis took him back, and they worked together again. But the Colonel, Elvis's manager, often tried to control things. One day, Marty and the Colonel had a big fight over money for the guys' meals. The Colonel demanded $300, and when Marty refused, the Colonel got angry. Elvis backed Marty up, and the Colonel never tried that again. Elvis was also curious about different religions, especially Judaism. He asked a lot of questions about Jewish people and their culture. Some of this interest came from his friendship with Marty Lacker, who was Jewish. Elvis even learned some Hebrew phrases, and would joke around with his friends using them. Elvis's life was a mix of fame, mystery, and personal struggles. Despite everything, he had a loyal group of friends who stuck by him. They saw him at his best and his worst, and they loved him for who he was. As the years went on, Elvis's journey became more and more complex, but his impact on the world of music and culture remained as strong as ever. In the end, Elvis was a star, but he was also just a man, trying to find his place in a world that often seemed bigger than him.